Did you notice I didn't even stay to the end of your last test? I was confident you could finish. Do you know where I was? I was outside watching some deer frolic. You don't even care about the outside, do you?
In our first implementation, gestures were automatically selected based on the player's context. For example, blue might do a special gesture when standing on a floor button. Players became bored of seeing these gestures so quickly that they stopped using them before discovering any of the special context. Because of this, we decided to give players control of gestures as a way to express themselves, but when shown the full set from the start, they were overwhelmed by all the choices. By awarding gestures as the game progresses, we allow players to familiarize themselves with each gesture in turn. Leaving visible empty slots in the gesture wheel lets players anticipate that they'll be rewarded with cool new gestures as they progress. The gesture wheel provides quick access so that players can feel comfortable tossing out a gesture during downtime, letting them pick the perfect moment to share a high five.
We have a taunt where one robot steals the other's core. When implemented, it was the only taunt that required one person to initiate. Because of this, we were afraid that it would be used for griefing. We were in the process of rethinking our approach when early playtesters rated this as their favorite taunt. It was also the most used team taunt because it only required one player to initiate and was easier to use than the others. We ended up changing all the other team taunts to emulate the way stealing the core works.
Airlocks were introduced mainly as a way to allow players to focus on individual puzzles. In some of our early investigations, areas contained puzzles that were meant to be solved as a group, as well as others that were for individual solution. But we found that if players could move freely between them, they logically assumed that the individual puzzles were part of one big puzzle. This had bad results. For clarity, we created these airlock-like spawn rooms that act as checkpoints between puzzles. Once both players entered the airlock, we lock off access.
In Left 4 Dead 2, we authored simple, fogged, black versions of the world as monolithic models to avoid the CPU overhead.
Did you notice I didn't even stay to the end of your last test? I was confident you could finish. Do you know where I was? I was outside watching some deer frolic. You don't even care about the outside, do you?
Airlocks were introduced mainly as a way to allow players to focus on individual puzzles. In some of our early investigations, areas contained puzzles that were meant to be solved as a group, as well.
In Left 4 Dead 2, we authored simple, fogged, black versions of the world as monolithic models to avoid the CPU overhead of rendering the world again for water reflections. This worked well for the Left 4 Dead 2 outdoor environments where most light comes from the sky. But Portal 2 is almost entirely indoors, so the color and value of the world geometry is apparent in the water reflections. Since the Portal 2 world geometry is relatively simple, we automatically build a version of the world geometry that has a single texture that combines both lighting and surface shading, along with another texture that has just surface shading. The latter texture is used when rendering dynamic lights. These textures are at the same spatial resolution as the light maps and get packed into a single large atlas texture per level. Drawing the simple world imposter takes very little CPU time, which was a limited resource on Portal 2 due to the many portal views, split-screen views, and water reflection views that we needed to render. We initially planned on using the world imposters only for water reflection rendering, but we ended up using it to improve the performance in split-screen mode, where it is used for rendering distant portals and portals that are 2 levels deep. We also used the world imposters to render water in full-screen co-op mode to give us some performance overhead, since the co-op mode has more portal views to render than single-player mode.
We noticed that after playtesters had solved a difficult puzzle together, they'd sometimes pause before funneling through the exit door to repeatedly jump up and down in excitement. We realized that these meeting places would be the perfect time to allow players to high-five each other and celebrate their victory in style. Our first interface attempt had one player initiate a high-five by holding their hand up and waiting. The other player could join in by selecting the same gesture. If they were standing in the correct positions relative to each other, they'd pull off a high-five. But learning the correct place to stand was too difficult, so we decided to automatically move the bots into the correct position for the high five. Sometimes, however, the player who wanted to high five would be left hanging as the other player ran ahead without accepting. Increasing the time that the initiator waited with his hand up gave the other player time to return and accept. But being frozen into place for more than a few seconds was too frustrating. So finally, we made players auto-accept the team gestures. Now when the mood strikes either player, the game always ensures a successful celebration.
Something that really surprised us was how often playtesters stated that they loved the basic experience of handing off a cube to their partner. Players didn't expect such a fundamental physical interaction to just work in a game. Before trying it for the first time, they would discuss their plan as if it were some unique or special new game mechanic. When it just worked, they were overjoyed.
Several puzzles in the game require the players to take on distinct, intertwined roles. We called these asymmetric chambers trust puzzles, because one player is often placing their life in the hands of the other. When one player accidentally kills the other, it almost always ends in laughter. So much laughter that we sometimes had to question if it really was a legitimate accident. These puzzles also require players to stay in constant communication, which naturally leads to some great moments of cooperative bonding. While some teams found these stressful, for many partners, these puzzles were their favorite type. But everyone agreed that they added much-needed variety and a nice change of pace. And by swapping roles, each player can get an entirely different experience within the exact same puzzle.
Early on, we realized that trying to tell your partner where to go, where to look, or where to place a portal was going to be really hard. Even with voice chat, saying "over there" doesn't give enough information to your partner within the 3D space. Players kept wanting to get up and point directly at their partner's screen. We developed the ping tool to address this problem. Because the ping tool was so important, we decided to train players in its use before we did anything else. We held back on the vast majority of player actions and let the players focus entirely on the ping tool. This is why the co-op bots start separated in a tube, without even the ability to walk or shoot a portal.
Most players don't realize that the ping tool is context sensitive. When they're playing voice enabled, players usually rely on the look portion of the ping tool. Without voice, icons such as press the button or stand here become much more important.
Several puzzles in the game require the players to take on distinct, intertwined roles. We called these asymmetric chambers trust puzzles, because one player is often placing their life in the hands of the other. When one player accidentally kills the other, it almost always ends in laughter. So much laughter that we sometimes had to question if it really was a legitimate accident. These puzzles also require players to stay in constant communication, which naturally leads to some great moments of cooperative bonding. While some teams found these stressful, for many partners, these puzzles were their favorite type. But everyone agreed that they added much-needed variety and a nice change of pace. And by swapping roles, each player can get an entirely different experience within the exact same puzzle.
Most players don't realize that the ping tool is context sensitive. When they're playing voice enabled, players usually rely on the look portion of the ping tool. Here become much more important.
In laying out the structure of our hub, we had a number of challenges that were new and specific to co-op play. We have to assume that each player has made different progress throughout the game, playing with different partners. Starting in the neutral center of the hub was a way of making sure that they had a chance and place to coordinate. Players needed a way to agree on where to go, and a way to visualize each other's completion data. As they played, they needed concrete feedback on how much progress they had made. In seeking solutions, we felt it was important to keep the player in the game space, rather than resorting to menus and UI that would take them out of the game. Therefore, players can clearly see their status over the doors, and they navigate by walking to the course in the 3D space. GLaDOS is there to connect the experience to the single-player game, while also holding the player's hands a bit to keep the co-op goals and feedback clear.
The visual design of the robots began with lots of concept art. The initial round of concepts explored all kinds of forms, from human to the more abstract. We found ourselves gravitating towards shapes that reminded us of the sphere and the turret in the original Portal. Whilst keeping with the established Portal design aesthetic, we were keen to create all new characters, and being a duo, it was important that they were their own separate designs, rather than identical copies of each other. Unlike, for instance, Team Fortress 2, where a clean silhouette is essential for communicating the nature of a character, we had an opportunity here to play with designs that were a bit messy, with things sticking out of them so they looked half manufactured, half improvised. Once we had agreed on rough designs in 2D, we began to build the shapes in 3D, and this is where the next level of improvisation and experimentation occurred. Usually, a model will be designed and built in 3D and then rigged for animation, but here we allowed the rigging process to inform the models. We wanted to celebrate the mechanics of robots. We allowed function to dictate form, and in terms of detail, they started to design themselves once you start thinking about motors, ball joints, actuators, and all that sort of thing. The classic duo is often made up of two contrasting body types, short and squat next to tall and wiry, and it's not hard to see Laurel and Hardy, C-3PO and R2-D2 in these characters. Even though we had the freedom to make our silhouettes a bit untidy, it was still important that they remain readable as anthropomorphic bipeds. We wanted players to feel free to make mischief for their partners, in a typically human way, but without creating any kind of gore. The robots were perfect for this.
Our initial goal in designing the hub was to provide players with a lot of choices, so that they could sample a variety of game types. The idea was that if they got stuck or needed a break, they could pick another test chamber or another mechanic to explore. In reality, this prevented us from doing sufficient training and limited the overall scope of the puzzles. With such a flat structure, it was much harder to layer old mechanics onto new ones, because we couldn't guarantee that players understood what they needed to know to solve a puzzle. By going linear, we could guarantee prior knowledge and provide a much better experience, more satisfying pacing, and a story that gathered momentum over a long period of time.
In our original robot designs and the first animation tests, we started with the premise that, being robots, their movement should have limited personality and be a bit more mechanical. The feedback of our game testers and the reaction of our fans to the trailers convinced us that a more whimsical approach to the animation would lead to a better experience. So we moved away from a sterile approach and found a whole new range of possibilities as we began to explore their personalities and gestures.
Since the co-op characters can die at any time, we needed a way to rebuild them quickly and often. Therefore, in co-op, we replaced the elevators that connected test chambers in single-player with disassembly machines. These are meant to reinforce the idea that since the robots are disposable, being destroyed is no big deal. In the robot world, it happens all the time.
It took a while for us to dial in the right approach for the co-op bot vocalizations. Initially, we recorded some in-house vocal performances and processed them heavily, with the resulting sounds being very robotic. However, as the animations being created for the bots were so broad and expressive, we soon realized we were going to need to try a different sonic approach. After a few more in-house experiments, we brought in D. Bradley Baker, who we had worked with to create the voices for some of Left 4 Dead's Special Infected. We worked with Dee to come up with 2 distinct vocal and character approaches for the bots and recorded a range of responses for each. Afterward, 2 of our sound designers each took on one of the voices and came up with a unique sound processing approach to create a distinct sonic personality for each bot that still allowed the energy and expression of Dee's performances to shine through. In the following samples, you can hear what they sounded like in Dee's original performance and the result after the sound designers got through with them.
It's important to give co-op players a way to coordinate their action. Seeing how our players naturally wanted this ability, we decided to support it with the ping timer and ended up designing some puzzles around it. Due to lag and other issues, syncing up actions over voice chat turned out to be rather difficult. Therefore, we created the countdown timer as a way for players to keep in sync. It's completely predictable. Both players see the go at the same instant, and the clocks run in sync even if they're on different systems.
This puzzle requires one of Portal's trickiest logical leaps. Early playtesters often took longer than their patience would allow and were nearly ripping out their hair by the time they'd finally solved it. But almost everyone insisted that the payoff was by far their favorite moment in all of co-op. We significantly reduced the average solution time by adding a puzzle just before this where 2 cubes repeatedly collide, but this almost completely robbed the appeal from what was once a high moment. So instead, we decided to make a few subtle adjustments and leave players with the responsibility to make the final leap. First, we added a puzzle 4 chambers earlier to teach players to fling by cutting their hard light bridge and falling into a surface directly below. We then subconsciously primed the thought of mid-air collision by having players repeatedly ricochet weighted spheres against a hard light bridge. Finally, we designed this room's layout, lighting, and decals so that players would see the entire space as a symmetrical whole and visualize the bot's fling path. By planting shards of the idea in their heads, we allow players to own that exciting dual collision epiphany while keeping their sanity intact.
For a while, we were on the fence about whether to keep the Team Taunt hug in the game. Some felt it wasn't suitably robotic, while others had a concern that perhaps it showed too much emotion for these characters. But once it was animated for a trade show trailer, many of our concerns were washed away by the positive reaction of the fans. It was a huge success.
The levels in Portal 2 are much more complex than in the first game, and as a result we've had to beef up the player movement algorithms. The player is represented as an axis-aligned box in the world, which creates a problem for portal teleportation because portal teleportation is almost never axis-aligned. To improve how we handle this, we trace the player as the axis-aligned bounding box they would use on each side of a portal simultaneously, and merge the results into something usable. We have to predict quite a bit more than previous Source Engine games because portals and projected entities change the way the player moves through the world. Prediction itself is a mind-bending headache when dealing with portals. We're already dealing with a non-linear space, now we also have to deal with non-linear time in a non-linear space.
Writing GLaDOS for co-op introduces some interesting problems. In single player, you can count on players paying attention and being caught up in important moments. In co-op, you can count on two players chatting about what they just did as GLaDOS delivers an important line. To help with this issue, we broke up the story beats into smaller sections so players don't become impatient. We also repeat the points multiple times to ensure the message sinks in even if you missed it a few times. Lastly, we also give players room to talk. For example, when you die, there's a 2-second beat for you to laugh or yell before GLaDOS speaks. It is important to give those places for players to speak because the best part of co-op is the shared experience.
In just a moment, the word
Good morning. You have been in suspension for 50 days. In compliance with state and federal regulations, all testing candidates in the Aperture Science Extended Relaxation Center must be revived periodically.
Hi, my name is Gabe Newell, and welcome to Portal 2. When we released the original Portal in 2007, it was an experiment to see how gamers would respond to a different kind of gameplay and storytelling experience. Portal went on to win a bunch of awards, sell many copies, and, most importantly, resonate with gamers in a way that no other Valve title has. The challenges for us in building Portal 2 were to live up to people's expectations, to take you back to the world of Chell and Aperture Science, and to surprise gamers again, not with more of the same, but with more of the new. And I think it will be, mostly, a pleasant surprise. To listen to a commentary node, put your crosshair over the floating commentary symbol and press your use key. To stop a commentary node, put your crosshair over the rotating node and press the use key again. Some commentary nodes may take control of the game in order to show something to you. In these cases, simply press your use key again to stop the commentary. Please let me know what you think after you've had a chance to play Portal 2. I can be reached at gaben@valvesoftware.com. I get about 10,000 emails each time we release a game, and while I can't respond to all of them, I do read all of them. Thanks, and have fun.
The idea of being stuck forever in a state of stasis that looked like a crappy old motel room had been in our minds for a long time, but we weren't sure exactly how we wanted to rip you out of it. There was some debate over whether the opening sequence happened inside the player's head or not. There was an alternate opening where Aperture had hooked up all of its cryo-stored test subjects to an incredibly boring hotel room simulator, which Wheatley would then wake the player from. Eventually, this was discarded as too difficult to explain in the short time allotted, and we opted to change the hotel room to a container ride on a rail. This allowed us to show the player, rather than tell them about how they and other test subjects have been stored, show some of the scale of the facility, and even hint at how much time has passed. We also get to gradually reveal all of this through the destruction of the container itself as it moves and bangs into things. Overall, this gives the player a much more dynamic and visceral introduction to Portal 2.
The writers went back and forth over whether or not Wheatley had tried escaping with other test subjects before waking the player up. It was an interesting idea, and you can still hear remnants of the story arc in some of the dialogue. But at the end of the day, it was just too expansive a concept to sell, so it's hinted at, but not overtly mentioned until the end.
You should now feel mentally reinvigorated. If you suspect staring at art has not provided the required intellectual sustenance, reflect briefly on this classical music. Good. Now please return to your bed. Good morning. You have been in suspension for 9999999. This courtesy call is to inform you
Anyone
that
in
all
there?
test subjects should vacate the enrichment
Hello?
center immediately. Any test subject
Are you
not emerging
gonna open
from
the door
suspension at this time
at any
will
time?
be assumed to have exercised his or
Oh, God. You look good. Looking good, actually. Are you okay? Are you... Don't answer that. I'm absolutely sure you're fine. There's plenty of time for you to recover. Just take it.
Please prepare for emergency evacuation.
Stay calm. Stay calm. Prepare. That's all I'm saying. Prepare. It's all fine. All right? Don't move. I'm going to get us out of here. Oh, you might want to hang on to something. Word of advice. Up to you. You all right down there? Can you hear me? Hello? Most test subjects do experience some cognitive deterioration after a few months in suspension. Now, you've been under for quite a lot longer, and it's not out of the question that you might have a very minor case of serious brain damage. But don't be alarmed, all right? Although if you do feel alarmed, try to hold on to that feeling, because that is the proper reaction to being told that you've got brain damage. Do you understand what I'm saying at all? Does any of this make any sense? Just tell me, just say yes. Okay, what you're doing there is jumping. You just jumped. But never mind. Say apple. Apple. Simple word. Apple. Just say apple. Classic. Very simple. A-double-P-L-E. Just say apple. Easy word, isn't it? Apple. How would you use it in a sentence? This apple's crunchy. You might say... Okay, you know what? That's close enough. Just hold tight.
All reactor core safeguards are now non-functional. Please prepare for reactor core meltdown.
Okay, look, I wasn't going to mention this to you, but I'm in pretty hot water here. How you doing down there? You still holding on? The reserve power ran out, so of course the whole relaxation centre stops waking up the bloody test subjects. Hold on, this is a bit tricky. And of course, nobody tells me anything. No, why should you tell me anything? Why should I be kept informed? You know, about the life functions of the 10,000 bloody test subjects I'm supposed to be in charge of. Why? It's close. Can you see? Am I gonna make it through? Have I got enough space? Just gotta get through here. Okay, I just gotta concentrate. And whose fault do you think it's going to be when the management comes down here and finds 10,000 flipping vegetables? Alright, so no, I hit that one. Okay, listen, we should get our story straight, alright? If anyone asks, and no one's going to ask, don't worry, but if anyone asks, tell them as far as you know, the last time you checked, everyone looked pretty much alive, alright? Not dead. Okay. Almost there. On the other side of that wall is one of the old testing tracks. There's a piece of equipment in there that we're going to need to get out of here. I think this is a docking station. Get ready. Good news, that is not a docking station. So there's one mystery solved. I'm going to attempt a manual override on this wall. Could get a bit technical. Hold on. Almost there. Remember, you're looking for a gun that makes holes. Not bullet holes, but don't worry, you'll figure it out. Seriously, do hold on this time.
The container ride destruction sequence provided some unique technical challenges. The dynamics you experience are actually computed as two separate but nested simulations.
And
The first is a course scale simulation designed as a stress element analysis pass. This pass computes the overall gross motion of the container itself and computes the collisions and breakpoints based on path keyframe data and a network of constraints. As the container bumps and crashes along, the constraints start breaking and the room progressively starts to come apart. There are over 300 rigid bodies and 900 constraints in this rig, all individually configured for properties like tensile, friction, and collision response. The course simulation portrayed gross motion that captured the main dynamics of the ride, but not the fine details. The product of the course simulation was then used to deform spline-based surfaces representing the container geometry, which in turn were parents to fine debris anchored as rigid bodies. As the surface deformations increase, anchors are broken and the fine debris rigid bodies are released into the simulation. The fine simulation also includes the interior furniture and the model detailing. The two simulations were then connected using cache data and were driven together by a series of scripts. Due to the computational complexities of having two nested simulations, we had to come up with some solutions to some interesting mathematical problems. One problem was that the nested nature of the simulations resulted in some instability in the fine debris calculations due to floating point computational limits. The solution employed for this was to compute the fine debris on a stage where the root transform of the course simulation was essentially cancelled out and stored for later use. This allowed us to more accurately detect the fine interactions between the debris and the environment. Post-simulation, the root transform position and inertia were reapplied to the details. We solved the problem of trying to compute the player within this highly dynamic environment by putting them in a virtual room that has all the base shapes of the rendered container, but is simply used to compute player navigation. It's hidden somewhere else in the map. The viewpoint of the player is then parented to the course simulation transform, resulting in the final rendered frame. At the end of the ride, the player is teleported into the actual game space.